И у нас сегодня потрясающий лектор Бриджет Конор, старший преподаватель Королевского колледжа Лондона. Да, Бриджет исследует кинопроизводство, но не так, как это обычно делают историки кино. Бриджет смотрит, как кино производится на площадке, кем оно производится, что такое кино как труд, да, и насколько это хорошая работа. Вот. Сегодня мы, собственно, об этом поговорим с привлечением известных фигур, таких как Питер Джексон. Я думаю, что многие знают, кто это, и с нетерпением ждут этих подробностей. У нас расписание, как обычно. Бриджет будет говорить примерно час 10, час 15, и после этого у нас будет примерно полчаса на ваши вопросы. Не забудьте включить наушники, канал, кому они нужны, канал 5. Пожалуйста, Бриджет.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Rita, for that introduction. I'm going to sit down for some of this. I hope that's okay, but I will try and stand so it's not so you can stay awake, maybe. Okay. So I'm not sure what Rita said there. Maybe terrible things about me. She said Peter Jackson. No, Peter Jackson. I'm going to come back to in one moment. So thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be with you tonight. And this is the title of my talk, Behind the Scenes, Is It All That Great? Yes. Yes and no is the short answer, but I'm going to give you a longer answer in the next maybe hour and 10 minutes. So as Rita said, my name is Bridget Conor, and I'm from King's College in London. But originally, I'm from somewhere else that you may recognise, sort of. So this is New Zealand, or maybe now as we need to call it, Middle Earth. So this is the map of New Zealand, which is, kind of turned into Middle Earth, because you may know this already, but the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit 2 trilogies now have both been filmed in New Zealand. So before I tell you anything more about that story, I want to just show you a short film clip. So I'm just going to let this play. There's not too much English, just maybe look at the beautiful pictures of New Zealand, and then I will explain it a little bit more when I stop it. So now I'm going to play the clip. Ooh, maybe. Yes.
Hello, welcome to the first of our vlogs on the making of The Hobbit. It's amazing to be back here again. This is Bag End, exactly as it was in The Lord of the Rings. And it's actually built in our B stage here in Wellington, which is exactly the same stage as it was built 12 years ago. We've been shooting for a few days now, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a little look at the lead up to filming and some of the pre-production that led up to the first day of our shoot. And I look forward to keeping you up to date as we go through the next 2 or 3 years. See you soon. Oh, you're in 3D. Looking good. See ya.
And this pulls beautifully. This looks great when it's drawn.
Oh, so it actually works. And he can also go fighting with the remnants sort of hanging onto his body and be impaling people.
We wanted to create a very non-human shape.
We do need to do a little vlog. You might want to say hi to the fans of The Hobbit.
Fans.
Yeah. Shy artists. Oh dear, oh dear. So we're going up to wardrobe, and we're having a look at a couple of dwarf wardrobe and makeup fittings, which is always exciting. Not that we'll show you much in this particular vlog, because we'll save that for the future, but at least you'll get to see a little bit of our wardrobe department. a lot of very busy people working and a lot of costumes. A lot of interesting textures and detail and leather and embossing, and it's all pretty cool up here. It's like a sort of a big wizard's workshop. Hello. Oh my God, hello. Very good. You can use them like a mace.
Oh, yeah,
You can just
absolutely.
swing knocking and then cut the throat and whack the
Glenn was
scalp.
saying there's a nice
So, you know,
bit where you just go and take out about 10 orcs.
Right,
with the-
yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna just stop this. Pause it. Ah,
Now this is a...
pause. Apologies. I wanted to keep watching. Okay, so I'm not sure, maybe some of you have seen this. Has anyone watched all of the Hobbit full production? Wow, one person, dedicated. So this was the first of the Hobbit's film production video blogs. And this was a production diary made by the producers of the Hobbit films, as you can see, maybe, during the production. So this is kind of a really interesting little video for us if we are interested in blockbuster film production. We get some really interesting behind-the-scenes footage, and I think you could tell that that's what we were doing. We were going behind the scenes to watch the production as they are preparing. The one little subtitle you see there was 4 days until filming begins. So they're in pre-production, and we just in that short clip, you got quite a few different insights, right? You saw like the swords being made. Then you go and you see the visual effects and the motion capture for a moment. Then Peter Jackson takes you to see the leather and the costumes. And then you go into, I think it was like a casting. There was something with the dwarfs. So some of it was pixelated out, so we couldn't see everything, but we could see quite a bit of what was going on behind the scenes. And this is an important starting point for me in this talk. It's that we're getting a nice insight here into what being at work behind the camera looks like if we didn't know already. If we are outside the industry but interested, this helps us to see what is going on every day. And of course, we are led here by our fearless leader, Sir Peter Jackson. He is a Sir now in New Zealand. It's very important that I tell you that. He is Sir Peter Jackson, the creative genius, the kind of leader taking us on this journey. So this is a starting point for my talk. As film audiences and film fans, and maybe I suspect some of you might also be film producers or workers in the film industry, we now have more information and insight into how films are produced than we ever had before. And interestingly, the producers of The Lord of the Rings were some of the pioneers of this kind of insider information. So when those first 3 Lord of the Rings films were filming in New Zealand, they started in 1999, so quite a few years ago now, these early video production diaries made during production and uploaded online were really exciting at the time, certainly exciting in New Zealand, and exciting for our knowledge about films and how they are produced. And now, we're now in 2017, this kind of stuff is part and parcel, right, of film marketing. We expect this kind of stuff, not only before we see the film, maybe, although maybe we don't want to have the spoilers too much, but we also expect them then afterwards on the DVD extras and all the stuff we get later on. This also, I think, creates a really exciting buzz about the films, right? There was one point there where Peter Jackson said, I'll tell you something, but I won't tell you too much. I just want to give you a little taste and get you excited. I'll tell you more later. So we're kind of excited. We're like desperate. We want to know more about the Hobbit films. So as I said, this gives us a lot of insight into how films are produced, but also just simply what this particular kind of creative and craft process looks like. We get a whole lot of insights into the kinds of work that get done. So in this talk, I want to discuss all of this stuff in a few particular ways. I want to talk about creativity and the creativity that goes into film production of different kinds. Also collaboration, and how collaboration is so important. We saw there, I don't know how many people collaborating in the production of the Hobbit films, and working practices in film production. So I'm drawing on what I'm part of in terms of a research field, which is generally called media production studies. Pretty obvious, really. The study of media and how it is produced, and in particular, labor studies. Within this field, then, we are really, really interested in these behind-the-scenes insights. They're not just about buzz. They actually tell us really important things, I think, about the dynamics and the hierarchies and the power relations, potentially, that go into this kind of creative process. So I'm going to kind of throw out a number of questions and maybe give you some answers, but then I'm hoping there's also time for some questions. You might have questions, and we can have a discussion later. So the kinds of questions I'm interested in asking are, how are creativity and collaboration experienced on even a really huge film production like this, involving hundreds, maybe thousands of people at different points in the process? Who is considered creative and who is not in this kind of a context? Are certain people considered more creative than others? And if so, why? And also, who is included in this business? And it is a business, right? Not only is it a creative practice, and who might be excluded from this process? So finally, is it all simply fun and games and Peter Jackson playing with his 3D glasses, fun times? Or is there a dark side? And what does that dark side look like? What does all this shiny stuff hide? So we're going to get to that too. So I think maybe Rita already mentioned to you, and I've said I'm originally from New Zealand, and this is where I began my first media production research project, which was, unsurprisingly, about the filming of the Lord of the Rings trilogy in Wellington in the early 2000s. Wellington is the capital of New Zealand. So at this time, I wanted to know what were the effects of this huge, it's a transnational production, studio-funded, Hollywood-funded, blockbuster film. As I already said, 3 films shot simultaneously. But what did this huge production, what were its effects on the small, pretty underfunded local film industry at that time? And what effects did it then have on local film workers? Did they love this production? Were they excited about it? What were their experiences of it as it was happening? What was interesting is that when the production came to New Zealand, there were lots of creative industries policies developing, so cultural policies, right? Support for and funding for the creative industries in New Zealand. And that was especially tied to the film production industry because of Peter Jackson and his success. So we got lots of images at the time. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to come out of there. 1 second. Oh gosh. Didn't mean to do that. 1 second. Okay. So, apologies. We got lots of images. This is the kind of thing that I was collecting in the early 2000s in New Zealand. So on the left-hand side, we have another image, New Zealand, home of Middle-earth. And there was lots of also tourist promotion, right? So, yeah, promoting New Zealand as a location for the filming of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but also as just a tourist destination, right? Come, and you can see how beautiful New Zealand is, and maybe you can, pretend to be a hobbit in a photo. It's going to be a good time, This is the tourism kind of thing. But not only this, there was also lots of investment, right, from the New Zealand government to support these films and the production, including lots of funding from tax, so from the New Zealand tax base, investment in technology like high-speed broadband so that they could film and send the footage back to Los Angeles and Hollywood overnight, and lots of infrastructure, so the building of lots of studio space as well. So in fact, New Zealand became known as Studio New Zealand in promoting other producers to come to New Zealand. They had one of the film premieres in New Zealand. These are some of the photos I took. I was there. I really, truly was. I have the photos to prove it. I'm not joking. So this was the premiere of the third film in the trilogy, The Return of the King. You may remember it, 2003. This was such a big deal in New Zealand that this is a parade that they had through the streets with all the Hollywood stars of the film, like driving along in cars so we could all cheer and clap at how amazing and exciting they were. So this was a very, very big deal for the country. And I was very interested in, what this meant for the New Zealand film industry. Here's a hint. I didn't think it was all that good, necessarily, for the New Zealand film industry. So I don't think I made myself very popular by criticizing it. So there was that. But New Zealand was very attractive for a number of reasons. Not only because of these beautiful landscapes, that you saw in those images, but it was English speaking that was helpful for the Hollywood producers who were pouring all the money in. Good exchange rate, so it was relatively cheap for the Hollywood producers. A good climate, and relatively cheap labour, right? So in New Zealand, film workers are not unionised, and they were relatively cheap to hire to be part of the production at that time. So another good reason, among many, to film. And that was what I was particularly interested in, as I've already said. How was the work of The Lord of the Rings, right, the production work, how was this made visible to us? Could we see it, right? We didn't have these video production blogs or diaries straight away. But there were interesting things. There were behind-the-scenes glimpses and commentary. There was a lot of discussion online about the films and their production. And there was lots of kind of promotional imagery, right? Images of the stars with politicians and so forth. So one of my preoccupations then became about, film and television production and work, right? We think that film and television production is many things, but unless you have been a film worker, we don't necessarily know what this work looks like. So once I came to London, I continued studying in this vein. And my next study, sorry, the image is quite small here, was about screenwriting, or screenwriters as creative workers. So this was my next project, which had some of the same themes. I was interested particularly in the work of screenwriting, how people worked, and this is now in the UK, the British film industry, and how they got work, both in the UK and then often also in the United States, right? So screenwriters were working and producing, writing for big films and small films in the UK, but also then often moving in and out of Hollywood as well. So I interviewed a number of writers about their working practices, about their experiences within these industries in which they were working, and particularly their understandings of their own creative work. And as I've already said, I was interested in creativity itself. What was interesting is when I talked to screenwriters, sometimes they would say, sometimes I feel quite creative if I'm sitting at my desk and I have a wonderful idea and I can write it down. But actually, they often said, out of all the kinds of creative work that they did, and they often did more than one at once, it was the least creative form of writing for them, right? They had lots of different outlets. And screenwriting, it was interesting, but not necessarily for its kind of creative benefits. So that was one particular thing I found fascinating. I'm going to come back and say more about screenwriting, but I just want to pause for a second here and say a bit more about media production studies, which I've already mentioned to you is the general field in which I'm working, and some of the other people I will mention soon have been working in for some time. And some of you may be aware of this. What is interesting is in film studies or in other fields such as this, what we're often interested in is the films themselves, right? The texts, the stuff that we can watch and we can make an analysis of a particular film. But for us, media production scholars, we're just as interested in the production process, right? How it is that the film gets to be produced. So we're not only interested in the final product, although of course that's really interesting, but we're interested, and we're also, it is interesting to think about, okay, how do audiences respond to films? What do they think about Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or Peter Jackson? But we're using empirical research, so I've already mentioned interviews with media producers, but also sometimes observing the production process, right, if it's possible to do. Maybe looking at archival research for films that have already been made, if there are archives that we can access. And I think, to relate to an earlier point I made, using things like behind-the-scenes footage, actually, to analyse and look at what a production process might look like, or at least how it is presented to the world, right, and to audiences. John Caldwell is one of the scholars who's been, I think quite pioneering in his production studies. And he argues that we can, by looking at these behind-the-scenes texts as part of our study, we can analyse what he calls industrial reflexivity. That is, understanding the ways that media producers talk about their work, right, and understand on a daily basis what it is they do, and how I think things like creativity and collaboration become part of that understanding. And maybe even more specifically, I've been interested in what's now come to be known vaguely as creative labour studies. So that is studying, creativity as a form of work, right, put simply. And how creative labour has become increasingly a crucial part of many of our national creative industries, right? I mentioned New Zealand previously. New Zealand has poured a lot of money and resources into building up and funding its creative sector. I know that it's the same case here to an extent. And therefore the government, right, or the state or private enterprise has an investment in creative labour and in building up creative skills. So in creative labour studies, we now have a number of different studies of different kinds of industries that have developed in the last 2 decades that have analysed the working practices of creative workers. Lots of different industries, and some of them you may know about and will be working in. Fashion, television production, advertising, music, fine art and museums, and film production. And what's really interesting is even though you might say those industries are actually really quite different, hugely different kinds of creative and craft practice, what is interesting is that in all of these studies, we get quite surprisingly consistent discussions, right, and features of the work. The way that people talk about the work and the why they do it is surprisingly consistent. So just to give you a summary, this is a generalization, but I think it's still useful. Here are some of the ways that people talk about creative work as a kind of wonderful and positive thing. Oh boy, sorry, I'm just going to skip through that. So, some of the key features of creative work, and some of you may be like, yeah, okay, I understand, this is me. It is expressive. It is pleasurable. Can't you see how happy Gollum is here? He's so excited. It's about self-exploration, freedom, autonomy. It's about choice, choosing your career and then making a name for yourself in a creative profession. It is about self-fulfillment. It's often informal, right? It's not about a hierarchy or just sitting in an office. It's can be relaxing. It's about friendly, who you know. Yeah, if someone's like, yeah, this is exactly me. It's inspiring. It's cool. It's egalitarian. It's non-hierarchical, playful, exciting. Okay, we could go on and on. I'm kind of repeating myself here. But to summarize, it is what some scholars would call good work, right? It's good work. It's work that actually is more than work, that makes us feel good, and not only good in ourselves, but like we are giving something good out, putting something good out into the world. So good work in terms of our creative process and the products, right? The things we make. But, unfortunately, there is potentially a dark side. So as well as all of this wonderful stuff, there are maybe some other aspects of creative labour which we maybe we don't hear quite so much about, or maybe we do because we talk about it at the bar afterwards. So these studies have also found a number of other things that creative labour is. Okay, Gollum's, he's not looking so happy now. It is about entrepreneurialism, which can be good, but means there is often a lot of pressure on you as a creative worker, right? It is often precarious. You don't necessarily know where your next job or your last job is coming from and where you're going next. The pay could be good, but oftentimes it's actually not that good. It can be pretty low. Maybe if you get paid at all. If you're an intern, you don't need to be paid. No, because you just do it for the love. Long hours, often no boundaries or, fine boundaries between work and play or leisure. A lot of stress and anxiety potentially in creative work because of all of these things. Worries about kind of keeping up, keeping your skills, keeping your skills contemporary, making sure you know how to use the latest software program. And again, informal, which can be difficult, right? This can be hard to manage. It can also, therefore, potentially be what scholars call bad work. Work that over time doesn't make you feel so great, right? And so this is the paradox that many scholars of creative labour discuss in their work. That this creative labour in all of its guises can offer so many things for us. Freedom, and creative joy and pleasure and everything. But that on the other hand, it can lead to forms of exploitation, or what some scholars even call self-exploitation, pain, and so forth. So we have to for me, I think some scholars would try and choose one or the other of these things, and I prefer not to do that because I think maybe for all of us that have some experience of this work, it is maybe both of these things at once. It's messy. It's good one day and bad the next, maybe like all work, yeah? So I want us to kind of hold both of these things together. And now I want to say a little bit more about the blockbuster film production particularly. Do we know what it's like to work on a big budget international production? If we don't, how would we find out? Where does this image of the fun and games of the film production come from? What do we see when we go behind the scenes? Well, here's just one example, but which comes from my personal experience because I was just looking for information about this film the other day. So this is just one image I took from Twitter. This is the Twitter feed for the American actor Mark Ruffalo. Very good actor. I like him. And the feed is actually the Thor feed. If you know Thor, the Thor franchise, yeah, of course. Who doesn't, right? So the new Thor Ragnarok film is due out October 2017. And so the marketing machine is really, it's kind of in high gear now. So here is the promotional image for the film. This is the kind of key cast members at Comic-Con, which is that big film, comic book, culture convention in San Diego in the United States. I don't know if you can kind of see, but we have the stars, Chris Hemsworth in the blue. We have Cate Blanchett. They're holding hands. They like each other a lot, I think. Oh, I'm just going to zoom in here. We also have the director. He's on the left. Oh, there's a theme here. He's another New Zealander. This is Taika Waititi, the director of the new Thor Ragnarok film. And we have, oh, sorry, I've cut his head off. Well, we have Mark Ruffalo down there. And Mark Ruffalo says, hey, something like, these are my co-workers. What a cool group. Love these guys. Yeah, really, it looks fun. Looks like a nice job. Here we have just one other example. This is from an on-set image that I took from Instagram of the production of A Wrinkle in Time. I'm not sure if anyone is excited about this. This is a Disney film currently shooting, oh boy, sorry, this is really getting boring now, in New Zealand. But we have, just to pull back, you can see some of the stars down the front. We have Reese Witherspoon. We have Oprah Winfrey is in there. And the director, Ava DuVernay, is also there. The story, the kind of caption is, again, we're having so much fun in New Zealand. It's beautiful. I mean, it really is. It's beautiful. Wow, it's cool. So these are the kinds of images we now get if we do a search for a film we're excited about, right? And this kind of behind-the-scenes stuff is fueled, I think, now by social media. And it comes from, these are all creative workers themselves, we presume. They are people working on the film, whether they are stars or people behind the scenes. Most of these people, they are the ones that are paid really well, right? These are the highly paid actors, directors, and so forth. Maybe the most privileged creative workers there are, right? So they have the privilege, they have the status, and they're going to show us these little glimpses of the film in production. And if you do a search, as I just did the other day, you get all kinds of images. These are some more I just pulled from a search for Thor Ragnarok behind the scenes. We have the actors in the gym, I think. We have some from set, and we have some, the stars with people taking selfies on the street. So as I've already said, these kinds of images, they build a bit of buzz about the film, but they also make us, as audience members and fans, feel maybe a little bit closer. It's like, oh, Chris Hemsworth, he's just like us. I could be his friend. It's this nice feeling. And what's interesting is this is very different from a previous era in which a film set would be closed, right? You would not be allowed to take these kinds of pictures and put them out into the world, right? We're in a very different era. Even if these are not official images, we could simply get leaked images, right? From someone taking a picture on their cell phone and posting it to their own personal feed. And I think we can actually learn a lot from these kinds of images, as I've already said. They tell us, I think, about different kinds or modes of creative work. So I just want to talk about a couple of those for a minute and then relate this to a few more examples from film production. One, I think, key thing I've already mentioned, and this came through for me in studying screenwriters, is the tension or the distinction between your individual creative work as an individual person, director, writer, or grip, whoever you are, and the collaborative nature, the collaboration of creative work, which we see in all of these images as well. So there is a kind of we could call it a tension, or we could say it's kind of, complementary, but there's certainly something there that's interesting. The individual creative work versus the collaborative creative work. By using the term versus, I'm sort of implying it's a competition, and I don't mean that. But in a way, it can be. So again, I found in my research on screenwriting, screenwriters, they talked about it as sometimes like a dual personality, right? So on the one hand, they had their highly individualized time as a creative worker, where it's literally them sitting alone in the room trying to think of something amazing that's going to be the next Thor, whatever, film, right? So they're totally an individual creative entrepreneur trying to get the job and then get the next job, right? But at the same time, they're also fully collaborative workers. In fact, for screenwriters, their work only really becomes, valuable for them and anyone else when the individual screenwriter starts to work with other people, often very, very closely in a number of different kinds of collaborations. So they might be suddenly working with other writers or also a director and a producer. And suddenly, there are 10 studio executives also giving them notes and telling them, how to rewrite their script, to take account of all the other voices in the room. And for the screenwriters I spoke to, this actually did create often a lot of tension, right? So they found, on the one hand, a deep sense of all of those wonderful things I showed you on the previous slide. The pleasure of creative work was when they were just coming up with their ideas alone, with no other external forces. But as soon as those other forces came in, suddenly a lot of pain could be associated with that, right? Because once people started working with others, for screenwriters, that's when often they lost their creative control, right? They had to give their script to someone else. They had to give up ownership. Maybe they have to give up also their intellectual property rights. So they've literally lost control over it all. Maybe then they've also lost credit. They've lost authorship in the most extreme examples, of which I heard, unfortunately, quite a few. At the same time, collaboration was the source of a huge amount of joy and satisfaction, as some of those images show you. It is, in its best form, for screenwriters, they found a lot of fruitful, exciting, creative relationships could develop. They met people who they then worked with again and again and again. And that's often the case in the film industry and other creative industries. You work with a group of people once and you stay together as a creative unit and you move from project to project. So that collaboration and the kind of, the fellow feeling that it fosters is real and very important. So at the industry level, what I think is really interesting is if you move, from talking to an individual to thinking about the film industry as a place, as an ecosystem, what's interesting is overwhelmingly, when we talk about film production, we talk about the single creative author. I mean, sure, many of you know the auteur theory, right? The kind of talking about films as authored by a single creative genius, a single creative person. I've already mentioned Peter Jackson to you, and you saw him with his cool 3D glasses. And here's just another, this is, I'm kind of using it for effect, another very iconic image. I'm sure maybe some of you will recognize this guy. Oh boy, yeah, he looks strong, powerful, right? So this is the director, James Cameron. Maybe you know Titanic. Don't know if you've heard about a little film called Titanic. And there's Avatar, another very small film. What is interesting is that here is the iconic image, right, of the creative genius, the director. They get the prestige. They carry the camera. Often they also get, the retrospectives at film festivals, right? We get the career of James Cameron. Not so much with the screenwriters, maybe sometimes. Maybe stars. You're not really ever getting the visual effects. We're not getting a retrospective of the visual effects guys' work. Maybe not yet. Maybe this is coming. But often this means then, actually implicitly, we do get a hierarchy, right, of creativity. And it is about the creative as individual, not as collaborative worker, right? But we get a hierarchy. We have the most creative person, we presume, the director, and or maybe the writer at the top. And then we have the other, the workers down there that we sometimes see in the behind-the-scenes footage, but other times, we don't actually need to see them. And I think even this kind of an image that I show you here tells you a lot, actually, about relations of power in the production of media and culture. Who we consider to be creative and who not, or who we really don't need to worry about so much. Who is visible and who is not. To just compare James Cameron for a second, I'm going to give you another very different image of some creative workers. I'm not sure if you will recognize any of these. This was a very interesting moment. This was at the Academy Awards ceremony in Hollywood in 2013. There were a lot of protests outside this ceremony. And this was about the film The Life of Pi. I don't know if you know, some of you are nodding, some of you have seen this film. So The Life of Pi, that in 2013, nominated for lots and lots of awards, particularly for visual effects. As you can imagine, the film was beautiful to look at, lots of visual effects. Ang Lee, the director of the film, accepted those awards, one of which, Best Visual Effects, right? But, he just forgot. Unfortunately, he failed to thank any of the visual effects workers who actually worked on the film and made the visual effects that Ang Lee was then winning the award for. Interesting, somewhat ironic. So, and I think this is quite an interesting image here. The workers went out and protested at the awards. It's not often that you see a protest of visual effects workers or another kind of creative worker like this. And this then led, if you didn't know already, to a lot more discussion about working conditions in the visual effects industry, which, maybe there are some of you out there who've done this work. It can be very exciting and interesting, but it is also known for terrible working conditions and bad behavior on the part of, executives. Really long hours for extremely low pay, workers often being hired for one job or for a few days and then fired again, without recourse to complain. Demand rising and falling, workers, just generally having a pretty bad time. So this, interestingly, is a moment, it exposes the relations of power for a second. We find out a little bit about who gets the attention or not in film production, and we get a little bit of an insight into what these workers look like, right? Who are sitting there in the dark rooms rather than just on the credits we see at the end of the film. So another, I think, really important critical question that I have been asking in relation to these relations of power is who is included just in this business and industry and who is excluded? Or to rephrase, are inequalities in society at large mapping onto working practices in film production? And if so, are we interested in learning more about why? I hope so, because I'm going to tell you about them. I have been particularly interested in inequalities of gender, but I'll say a bit and focus on this now, but it's not only that. It's the other, I think, really interesting finding that has come out of these studies of media production I've been speaking about is that the media industries, generally speaking, the creative industries as a profession, are hugely exclusive industries. They really exclude a lot more people than they include, to put it bluntly. They exclude in terms of gender, and here are just a few examples of the kinds of diagrams of this you might have seen around. But they also exclude in relation to educational, socioeconomic background or class background, ethnicity, sexuality, age, region, where you might be in, London versus the rest of the UK, as one example, and disability. I could go on. So, if we look closely at this research that's kind of recently been conducted, we see that these inequalities, they do look different. It's not that it's a monolithic phenomenon across each industry, and they're quite complex. But there are, again, some interesting patterns. For example, there's evidence of what we call both vertical and horizontal segregation. And this work has particularly come from David Hesmanhauge and Sarah Baker, whose book, Creative Labour, is a really important one for the field. And they have demonstrated that if we take gender segregation as the example, that gender segregation in the film industry works firstly on the vertical axis, right? So that's most people in the positions of power in the making of big film productions, actually probably big and small, funders, gatekeepers, chief executives, senior managers, directors, writers, and so on, are generally older white men. And if we look horizontally, more women are represented in those types of work that are what we call sex-typed as female professions. Did anyone notice in the Lord of the Rings clip we saw earlier, there were lots of women in the costume department? Maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but many more women in professions sex-typed as female professions, makeup and costume or office administration, and men overrepresented in types of work that are historically sex-typed as masculine. So camera work, lighting, visual effects, again, the James Cameron image, like, I need the strong muscles to hold the camera. This is the kind of stereotype, at least, that we have. But interestingly, even at the highest levels of the industry, we have some interesting examples of kind of recent revelations. You might have seen this one, the gender pay gap in, now I'm using Hollywood as the example, between female and male stars. So although, maybe we would say, okay, there's bad behavior, but it's behind the scenes. Well, interestingly, lately we have had some revelations that show us, even at the highest level of the industry, we have these gender differences and a pay gap. So now this is another interesting contradiction for us. If creative work, as we've said before, is seen to be cool, it's seen to be creative, and creativity is supposedly open to all, right? This should be egalitarian, theoretically, right, as a place. So why this dark kind of side when it comes to inequalities? Well, I think one interesting aspect, and I'd be interested to hear if anyone can relate to this, is that if you are a creative worker, say you are a film production worker, you're working on a film set, and you experience some kind of discrimination. I mean, it could be sexism, it could be racism, it could be a kind of harassment, maybe simply you just didn't get paid for the day or the week, it can happen. Then often those are what we call unspeakable experiences, and Ros Gill has used this term. That is, remember, because creative labour is all of those things I said earlier, flexible, mobile, relying on passion and commitment, but these industries are also based on reputation, which many of you may know very well. They are about often who you know, your networks, the relationships, but also, I think, sometimes about protecting the aura of film production, for example, as fun and exciting, not as a place where bad things might happen, like harassment, for example. So I mean unspeakable because literally it is very hard to speak up about it if you have a bad experience, because to do so would literally threaten, your job, whether you can show up the next day. It would probably potentially be unlikely. You also often, you don't have any kinds of employment legislation by which, you could normally make a complaint. It's just not the case in lots of creative industries. Even Jennifer Lawrence has to kind of stay quiet until maybe someone hacks her emails or whatever, then we find out about it. So I think what's important for me as a media production scholar is thinking about, what we see, what is visible, but also what is invisible to us, what is hidden and for what particular reasons. As I've already said, film and television has an aura about it. There is a status to it. And it's also because of the proprietary and commercial nature of the work. Huge amounts of money, right, are at stake here for particular people involved in the process. But this means that also there is potentially a stake in keeping certain things hidden, revealing things, but maybe, not revealing some of those other things. I think the other really interesting thing here is that at least in the UK, and I will be interested to hear afterwards if some of you have similar thoughts on this, there has been quite a bit more attention paid in the UK to these issues recently. There are a lot more headlines about, why are there not so many women as men on television or, on screen, in film and so on. So there has been more discussion about this in the public arena. So maybe it is becoming a bit more visible, right? These issues around discrimination and inequality. Just one really recent example kind of exposed this again. I'm not sure if anyone's a Doctor Who fan, but this was the latest announcement that got a lot of attention paid, right? What does this mean? A woman's going to be Doctor Who? Shocking. Oh, but it's a good thing. That was just the latest kind of example of a broader discussion about why this would be necessary or why some were not happy about it. But another thing that I think is interesting is just as much as there has been a lot more kind of, critical mainstream media debate and dialogue about inequalities in cultural industries, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, interestingly. The discussion happens on both sides. At the same time, often these inequalities get justified in some way. We get certain, I think, kinds of arguments made again and again for maybe why we don't need radical change or why we shouldn't have some kind of radical change, or maybe why it's just a bit too difficult of a problem. So there are three arguments that often get used. Maybe some of these will be familiar to you. The first one is the meritocracy or talent argument. This is the argument that goes, well, it doesn't matter. If there are inequalities, it doesn't matter because it's all about talent, right? Talent will rise to the top in any industry. So if there are hiring practices which are, discriminatory or something, it doesn't matter because talent will always win, right? It's about merit, getting into these industries. It's only about talent, nothing else. I mean, really, I don't think that's really a particularly valid argument, because we know that there are very many talented people who are educated, highly educated in these fields, who never get into these industries, or who try, but they really struggle to stay in the industries. It can be really, really hard to make a long-term sustainable career. In fact, of the screenwriters I spoke to, none of them could survive, right? They had to find other kinds of work to make a living. They couldn't make a sustainable career. It was so difficult. And also, the talent argument really doesn't explain why there are lots of untalented people in the industry too, right? A bad film gets made. I'm not going to mention Michael Bay. Maybe you guys really like him, but he might be one example. So we also, interestingly, know that more women than men are now studying higher degrees, certainly in the UK. I'm not sure if this would be the same here, in a range of relevant disciplines, right? Culture, media, filmmaking, screenwriting courses. We then don't necessarily see those graduates moving up, right? We might see them in the industry in some way, but we don't necessarily see them moving up into the higher, right, decision-making, creative roles which would have either commercial or creative power. So that talent argument, I think, is not particularly helpful for us. The second argument is an interesting one, which is it's getting better. I don't know if anyone's heard this one. The argument kind of goes, well, things aren't great. Yeah, there are some problems, but they're not as bad as they used to be. So maybe slowly we're going to see some improvement. Now, that might be true. I hear this argument a lot, actually. I've often heard it, from different people, working in the industry saying, it's better than when I first started out, and that might be valid. But it's also, I think, worrisome. The statistics don't look so good if you kind of drill down a little deeper. It's interesting, during the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, in the television industry in the UK, women lost their jobs at the rate of 6 times that of men, falling to only 27% of the workforce by 2010. So that was maybe that was just a kind of a temporary thing because times were tough. But if you look at other kinds of inequality in film and TV production, things like ethnicity or disability, things are definitely not getting better. Between, I think it was 2006 and 2013, the number of people identifying as black or of minority ethnic backgrounds in British film and television dropped 30%. So, and the rates for kind of those who would say they are disabled in some way generally never get better. So depending on the kind of inequality we're talking about, the industry still seems to be not very hospitable, right, to anyone who isn't, able-bodied, certainly, and it doesn't identify in other ways. The final argument we often get is one about, I'm generalizing, but is about motherhood, right? The argument that says, well, women might be able to get into an industry like film production, but because women are mothers or they want to become mothers at some point in time, it means it means they just can't move up again. They get in, they can't move up. But the motherhood argument, again, I think is problematic. Yes, of course, women have a biological capacity to bear children. Yes, we know this. But I think the argument often gets used to kind of shut down the discussion entirely. Firstly, often in the mainstream media, at least in the UK, it's framed as motherhood, but not as parenting. And I think that's interesting. If we change that to parenting, that looks slightly different. We know that men also have children, and men also have children who work in the film industry. So they seem to kind of be okay with doing both of those things. Maybe, though, it's also really, really difficult, because I think it's really difficult for all parents in the film industry and other cultural industries. But what this kind of, I think, disguises for us is a much bigger problem. In the UK, there has been a consistent, over the past, especially, 10 years, a disassembly of the social safety net, right? For all parents, it is very difficult now to get childcare or any kind of care if you have a very demanding job. For example, a job in the creative industries and the film industry, where when you are filming, you are working, ridiculous hours, often for weeks on end. It can be very difficult if you have any kind of caring responsibility at all. And then again, that might be, pushing people out from the industry who would otherwise be in and be just as talented as anybody else. So I think all of these things, all of these arguments they're not really very helpful. They don't really push us forward in the debate about, how, if media production is not good or has difficult aspects, how can we make it better? Which, as those of us who are in the creative industries or want to be, we want to improve things if they are not good. I have a few thoughts and then I will conclude. Rita's nodding at me. Okay. So, firstly, I think, disrupting these kinds of arguments is important and quite helpful. We can call them out because they don't really get us anywhere, I don't think. But there might also be concrete strategies. Some of these you may be familiar with. If we want to change the numbers, if we think, okay, these statistics are not great, we want to do something quite radical. There has been talk about quotas in the British film industry, and it hasn't really got much traction up to this point. But there have been some interesting kind of concrete policies, right, to make a change. Here's just one example of this. If you know about it, you may have seen. So a change the Swedish Film Institute decided that they wanted to make a difference. So they committed to equal investment in women and men directors because the statistics previously were not good in Sweden. We know maybe Sweden is often kind of up for radical change. So the Swedish Film Institute reached 50-50 funding distribution between men and women filmmakers in just 2.5 years, right? The statistics were quite bad. They reached 50-50 in 2 years, which is quite good. So that's for publicly funded films, right? We're not really talking about blockbuster films here. We're talking about, publicly funded Swedish films. But that included a quota system and some other kinds of monitoring that went on behind the scenes, right, to try and ensure and upskill people. But of course, I think also, a kind of a symbolic change is needed as well. And it's a little bit trickier to know how a symbolic change or a cultural change happens. But I think in some way, we need to, as cultural workers and or as media scholars, try and really reclaim, I think, the emancipatory possibilities of cultural production. It is not just about shifting the numbers, but it's about a cultural change. That might be still exposing, I think, where things need to be improved, where things are not good, and where things need to change. But it is important, as I said, cultural work is so often coded or understood to us, as individualistic, as centered on individual creative genius. But creativity, we know, is a deeply social collaborative act. It does, it doesn't need to be based on, or the default position doesn't need to be exclusion or hierarchy or inequality. It doesn't have to be that way. And if anywhere can be more emancipatory, I think it should really be creative work. Whether a blockbuster film production or anywhere else. And a symbolic change at the level of blockbuster film production would be great, I think, for the rest of the cultural industries. So I suppose finally this is why I would say that I think media production studies, of course I would say this, but this is why I think media production studies is really important. First of all, these scholars, there needs to be a dialogue and a conversation with those who actually do the work. Right? That is important. So some of you might be like, I don't know what you're talking about, Bridget. Things are great. You can tell me that in a second. But firstly, I think it is very important to continue to look for and make this visible as work, right? Creativity is about creativity and freedom and all of those things. But it is work, and that's important. We can, as I said now, kind of drown in behind-the-scenes footage or, leaked emails about the gender pay gap for Jennifer Lawrence if we want to. There is so much material there for us, and yet still I think that so much is hidden or opaque or unknown about working conditions, about what it is actually like to work in these productions. And that's, again, as I said, because often these things, when it's good, we can talk about it, but when things are bad, you're not allowed to say anything. And a little bit more of, maybe this is where media production scholars can help, a little bit of exposing that darker side, I think can be valuable. I hope it can be valuable for media production workers. I would also say that, if things are still hidden and invisible, whatever they might be, that also is not helpful for what it does is shut down debate and critique. It is really easy and effective to silence the voices, the protests of media production workers, especially if they have less power, and aren't as visible. Because they are told, you shouldn't complain, stay quiet and silent. So I think it is incumbent upon all of us as scholars and workers to be able to speak for those who maybe are not able to. In saying all of this, I kind of want to have a final caveat, which is I'm very mindful of the fact that, as production scholars or historians, as those of us maybe working in the industry or wanting to work in the industry, we kind of have to be self-critical as well. I mean, yes, this work is precarious, it's unequal, it might be invisible, but, these are still really elite jobs, Most people are still getting pretty well paid. How precarious really is it in relation to other kinds of workers? So we kind of need to keep a little bit of perspective, I suppose, is necessary for us. And finally, I kind of want to return to this question, and I'm interested in what you all might have to say about this, as to who we define as a creative person, in our society. Who do we say is creative? You're creative over there, and that has all kinds of benefits and privileges, and you're, less than, or you're not so creative, and you're over there. I was thinking, for example, and also who makes those decisions? Who decides who is creative and who rewards that creativity, and what are those rewards? Because in blockbuster film production, they can be endless. There can be huge rewards, but they are certainly not distributed at all evenly. What about, some media scholars have talked about, what about those who are making the technology, which we then use to be creative? If you're making an iPhone in a factory somewhere, are you a creative worker? I mean, maybe we should start seeing those people as creative, and that might be helpful. I think it is helpful to build solidarity, right? And that is what is important, to make work visible and to make creative work visible in all its guises is important for fostering solidarity across media production industries and across industries, full stop. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. And, I have to finish with, sorry, Gandalf, Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Would be great.
The headphones.
Oh, okay.
Because
The headphones.
you should use the mic.
Use the mic, okay.
Окей, ну что, пул открыт для ваших вопросов. Поднимите, пожалуйста, руку, у кого есть вопрос, и к вам придут с микрофоном. Все боятся тогда.
Comments?
Comments? Один вопрос у нас есть с правой стороны. Так, пожалуйста. Уже. Can I take this one?
Раз. У меня вопрос. Почему в описании не было указано, что это не лекция, а ода феминизму?
Это указано в описании всего лектория. So, do you have translation? No. Okay.
Yeah, but I need.
Yeah.
Am I a strong feminist? Was this the question? I mean, yes. Yes, I am a feminist. And a humanist as well.
Еще вопросы про феминизм и не про феминизм, пожалуйста.
Comment in English. It's just because here in Russia we are basically more concerned talking about the back scene film production, about the fundraising and getting money for the films, and looking for the local talents and speaking more close about the talents rather than equality or inequality in the gender concerns. That's why maybe I comment the previous question.
So there are more important things to worry about. So maybe this is an explanation for why there are more important things in this industry to worry about than.
Yes, when we speak about the creativity, we mean is that how to organize the work between the people, what is the collaboration between the screenwriter, the director, and the producer who owns the budget, how to deliver the budget, to make this production, and it's basically more about the money.
More about the money. Although, but surely the money, yeah, I understand, yeah. So money is more important than maybe other social or cultural concerns. I'm just summarizing, okay.
I can give you a comment in English, I think, because will this be translated, right? Yeah. Good. So I am a film worker myself, and this is probably that attracted me here to see, like, scientific perspective on the reality that I live in, because definitely I can tell you a lot about the bad side of working in film. And especially after 12 years being a filmmaker, I'm kind of a guy down there, or kind of middle-range worker on set, actually, but probably a little bit closer to director and director of photography, because I'm a script supervisor. And this is my position, which is kind of, a single person department on set, which is, I'm quite independent and kind of connected to everybody on set, so it makes my position special. But once the shoot is over, I'm no one. And the reality in Russia of filmmaking is that the films are generally mainly state-funded. Add here some corruption. And after that, on those leftovers, crews have to deliver some footage, right, and produce some film. From the big initial budget, you get this, small budget Russian blockbuster, maybe 2 a year. So, so nobody speaks about bad side of cinema, because this is actually, in Russian we say «ссоры из избы не выносят», or you just don't swipe away your trash from your house. This is how we say it in Russia. Because you fear that you don't get another job, because you cover your producers, because everybody wants to be polite with everybody. And but the fear of not getting another job is like the general thing. And I counted that in this year, in the first 6 months of 2017, I worked for 18 days. And if I split my fees, which I earned in those 18 shooting days, that will be probably the salary of a cash desk person at a supermarket. So it's kind of this gap. You've got this super elite job, but you've got it for a very short time. So my idea right now is, because I'm a former journalist, which I transformed into a filmmaker 12 years ago, is to probably begin to write a little bit about, what the reality is actually in filmmaking, because people are definitely raped on sets. Maybe not everybody knows, but the typical working hours on film set is standard 12 hours. Then you will have from 3 to 8 hours of overtime, and you have to go on set and go from set by yourself. So it makes like from probably 24-hour work days. Sometimes it's not convenient for the producers to take you back home, so they arrange some place for you to sleep on set, and then you work another day in a row without going home or seeing your relatives, any ability to, get fresh clothes or anything. So this is how it goes. And probably because the film industry is so poor, there is no hope actually in kind of, unless people become more and more demanding and stand for their rights. I have to add also that there are no unions, and the minimum pay is like you barely can live on that. And also everybody feels this pressure because, for example, you work on set with actors who earn like 500,000 rubles a day. And then your salary, or there are some people on set whose salary is 50,000 a month. And so this inequality is kind of the norm, and actually nobody wants to really tackle it or work on it step by step.
Yeah.
Because people give up and they go away from this field because after 12 years you just spend more on your health care than you earn on film making. That's it. Also, I think one dangerous thing is that many people come to work in middle-range positions thinking that this is a creative job and I will develop my talent and my creative skills. But instead, they become just cheap labor, which is heavily misused by greedy producers. And they think that this is a privilege for you. This is like the general idea that they promote. This is a privilege for you to work in film. This is an elite job.
You should be You should be grateful.
Yeah, you should be grateful, definitely. And another thing, you spoke a lot about women, actually. I'm sorry I'm stealing the show,
okay.
But it's kind of,
very interesting.
I'm the voice from Russian industry.
Please.
So,
continue.
but you might see that there are many women working in Russian film, and this is not like for kind of equality reasons, but it's simply because women are considered easier to manage, easier to be oppressed. Also, this is kind of standard, they should be less paid. And also they're easier to negotiate. So sometimes there are some, female directors, but it's just because, nobody wanted this job to be, nobody of men wanted this job to be taken. That's it. So.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I guess I should, you've said it all really. I didn't say so much, and maybe it would have been more helpful for me to say more about the New Zealand industry, but your comments on the Russian industry actually make me think back to the New Zealand film industry, which I'm sure isn't exactly the same in terms of financial difficulties, but has had a lot of problems. And actually, I would say as a result of what I said at the beginning, or what I showed you, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because what it has ended up doing is you have the Peter Jackson industry, and that takes up all of the investment that there is, all of the talent, the infrastructure, everything, that is about, right, the money, but it's not only about the money, it's about the the kind of human resources and the creative resources go to that industry, and then the local industry is, it sounds like very similar, chronically underfunded, really, really struggling, all of the workers within it, I think, really struggling to make a living. Now, of course, if they get a job for a while on a Peter Jackson production, maybe that's then the paycheck they'll have for years on end. But that's not still really a sustainable model. And I suppose that's the bigger question. I mean, I would say that equality is part of having a sustainable film industry. So I think that it relates to the money, right? But I think it's a huge challenge to think about what a sustainable film industry, national film industry would look like, and how it can be, how it can be more appealing to anyone that wants to do it. But I think part of the problem is that, there's a kind of a sheen and an aura to it, and that is very, very different from what we've just heard about the working realities.
У нас есть, по крайней мере, еще 2 вопроса. Молодой человек и затем Маша.
Добрый вечер всем. Добрый вечер, Бриджет. Меня зовут Андрей, и будет небольшая такая вводная перед вопросом. Вам слышно? Окей. Буду на русском. Я работаю вообще в телекоме, но при этом дико люблю кино и вообще все, что с ним связано, и в том числе там есть какие-то попытки чего-то сделать самостоятельно. Слушая вас, очень многое на самом деле откликалось, в принципе, по моим предыдущим местам работы. Это и телеком, и инженер, и что-то похожее на это. И 3 постулата, которые доводятся до людей, что талантливый всегда найдет дорогу. То же самое рассказывается везде, но по факту люди пробиваются те, которые более удобные для руководства и так далее. Проблема материнства и дискриминации, она в принципе присутствует, наверное, везде, и в России просто об этом меньше всех говорят по сравнению с той же Англией. Вопрос заключается именно в том, почему именно на киноиндустрию обращаете большое внимание, несмотря на то, что проблемы, в принципе, схожие по всем рынкам труда. У меня есть свое видение, хотелось бы услышать, почему вы именно этому уделяете больше внимания.
Okay. So I think the question is about, why is it so appealing for the people who do it, but also for me to study it? Is that right?
Not only about it.
Sorry.
Why do you study cinema industry? Because the problems in terms of discrimination are similar in other industries.
Okay, so why particularly the film industry?
Yeah.
Oh, well, because I'm a fan. Maybe like everyone, this is where it comes from. My own personal interest is because truly why I did the Lord of the Rings project was because I loved Lord of the Rings. I was a big fan, if I'm being perfectly honest. I don't know, is this also not quite a common reason why people get into the film industry as well? You start out because you are a lover of film. Maybe it's not always, but I think you have some kind of you are either a fan or you have some kind of interest in the film industries and what they do. For me, I suppose I was always, at least for the Lord of the Rings case, I just felt at this time I was getting 2 very different images of the industry, because I had so many friends or people I knew working in the industry who were telling me increasingly dark tales, kinds of like the ones we've just heard here. But that wasn't stopping me from being a fan, right? I was holding both of those things together, but I suppose I wanted to understand what power does the aura of filmmaking have, right? It is obviously very powerful as an industry and always has been, right? It's like a dream industry for lots of reasons. So I kind of wanted to understand, what those dreams were about. And if you have a dream to work in those industries, you know, to what extent can they be fulfilled? Can they be fulfilled? What does that take? And what if you don't make it? I'm kind of increasingly interested. What if you have to do other things? What does that mean for the creative dreams you had?
У нас есть вопрос лишь от Маши, но я позволю себе влезть без очереди и задать вопрос, потому что мне кажется, что это продолжение того, что сейчас сказала Бриджет. Про фанатов. Если мы рассматриваем фанатов как часть киноиндустрии, используем термин партиципаторной культуры, participatory culture, могут ли фанаты, которые на самом деле видят много всего, что происходит, и не могут это игнорировать, изменить эту индустрию, так как люди в нее вовлеченные не могут из-за вот этого круга поруки и молчания?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just getting the last of it. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There are a couple of things that immediately come to my mind as an answer. Firstly, I actually am quite optimistic because more and more I think the technology allows us, or allows you as a film worker, if you see something really terrible happening, you potentially, I mean, yes, you could still, it would probably still be threatening to your position to do something, but you could potentially, I've seen quite a few cases of people filming things on their mobile phone on a film set and then just sending it out there anonymously. I think increasingly, if you wanted to kind of expose bad behavior, it might be possible to do it. I'm not exactly saying that anyone should, but the other interesting thing is that more and more this technology is becoming accessible to more people. I mean, when I was interviewing screenwriters, I heard a lot of them saying, there's no excuse. If you want to make a film, if you want to write and make a film, you could do it on your phone tomorrow if you wanted. You don't necessarily need all the architecture and structure, of a big industry to go into fulfilling your creative dreams. It might be possible. It might also be, for that visual effects case that I mentioned, the Life of Pi case, lots of the visual effects workers, they then made their own kind of videos about the industry and told us more about those working conditions. They kind of showed us from within what the industry looks like, and again, that went up online. So I think there are some quite interesting examples. I think the problem, though, with the argument about, you can just pick up your phone and do it, then... that doesn't really help us with all of the kind of the funding issues and the issues around the working conditions. If someone says, either you make a film or then the other argument is, because if you don't do it, you just didn't want it badly enough, right? Or you just didn't really have the drive to make the film, otherwise you would have made it. And that just... that's really tricky because for all of the reasons we've discussed around the way that society works, who has the funding and who doesn't, there are so many other barriers that I think we should be willing to talk about.
Спасибо, Маша, наконец.
Спасибо большое. У меня будет один вопрос к Бриджет, а другие комментарии к двум первым задающим вопросам. И вопрос к Бриджет я задам по-английски, а, соответственно, два других комментария прокомментирую по-русски. So the question is that can we look at these big blockbusters and analyze them as for example, as a social institutions by themselves, like apply the analysis of a social institution and see the blockbusters as a huge social organizations separately outside of the creative industry. So this is my question, and then I come to the two comments for the two speakers. Первый комментарий к молодому человеку, который спросил по поводу феминизма. Должна вам сказать, это абсолютно классическое сексистское комментарий. Феминизм нужен не только женщинам со звездочкой, кто знает гендерную теорию, прекрасно знает, что это такое, но и условным мужчинам, в том числе цисгендерным мужчинам, скорее всего, которым вы являетесь представителем. Поэтому ваши сексистские высказывания, они нерелевантны, и как раз отчасти благодаря такому видению происходит воспроизводство сексизма и воспроизводство всех тех проблем, о которых говорила Бриджет, чтобы вы просто знали свою ответственность, которую вы несете. Второй комментарий к молодому человеку, который бы говорил про кино. Как активный участник креативной индустрии и так далее, я могу вам сказать, как только вы будете, если вы будете писать анализ, вам нужно сказать, что вы белый мужчина, который пишет именно с этой позиции. Потому что если вы будете говорить, какой вы бедный участник креативной индустрии, но при этом не будете оценивать свою гендерную позицию и свои привилегии, вы далеко не уйдете. И, наверное, третьему мужчине я отвечу, что по поводу того, почему же мы смотрим на гендерный анализ именно киношной индустрии, в принципе, Бриджет уже вам ответила, но я также добавлю от себя, что вы абсолютно правы, что такой анализ может быть применен к любой части нашей культуры, к миру искусства. Я не только являюсь участником мира кино, но и мира современного искусства, могу вам сказать. Я также делала исследования по материнству, и это происходит везде. Вот эти три части, которые были указаны, что все рассматривается через талант, все рассматривается, ой-ой-ой, мы стараемся, мы делаем лучшее материнство. Этот анализ можно применить к любой креативной индустрии, к современному искусству, к любому IT и так далее. Потому что, к сожалению, это воспроизводство вот этих иерархических представлений. Опять-таки же, я вернусь к комментарию молодого человека. Если мы не будем думать о феминизме не как о мужененавистничестве, а как нормальной политической программе, в которой мы все должны вовлекаться, все эти проблемы будут воспроизводиться вновь и вновь. Если кто хочет мне задать вопрос по феминизму, я готова на это ответить.
Маша, Бриджет. Bridget?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question and your comments. I think I just respond to I appreciated all of those comments, but the question is a very interesting one. So this was, can we think about a blockbuster or any other film production as a kind of an ecosystem in its own right, maybe separate from any other wider industry or social institutions? I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And I'm not sure if anyone knows Howard Becker and his work on art worlds, but this is what I think about, as you mention it, in which he says something very similar, right? That any kind of creative act, especially involving a group of people, and he's really interested in the relationships and the connections between those people, it creates its own, he terms it an art world, a world in which, there is a common kind of a goal, and I think that is a really interesting way of thinking about it. I think then that also it allows us to look really closely and to privilege collaboration, relationships, connections between people, but potentially also not only people, but to materials, to technologies, to objects. And also just for me, thinking personally about about talking to people who work on a film set. I mean, it sounds like this is often an all-encompassing process, right? When you're in the creative process, when you're in the art world, for example, the rest of the world doesn't necessarily exist. And that's often because, as we heard previously, you're working hours and you're sleeping there and you have no life besides what you're making. But I think this is really helpful conceptually to think as well as, practically for individuals. Yes. Thank you.
Сколько у нас еще вопросов? Один. Давайте последний и остальное в кулуарах. Пожалуйста.
Здравствуйте. Благодаря вашей лекции стало понятно, что женщинам сложно пробиться в эту волшебную индустрию, и уж еще сложнее достичь каких-то небывалых высот. Однако, вы не могли бы что-нибудь посоветовать девушке, мечтающей и пытающейся стать настоящим кинооператором? Спасибо.
Oh, wow. We have an aspiring camera woman. Oh, yes, someone. Who's the person in the room who can give this woman a job? There must be some decision makers here. So the question is, offering advice about becoming a camera person. I mean, I wish I could give you the advice. I wish I would like to see you as the James Cameron up there. I mean, I have quite a few friends who have become camera people in recent years, and they studied like anyone else, right? I mean, maybe you're already doing this. They kind of went and did a course. I mean, it's interesting because I hear lots of people who I interviewed who worked in the film industry said, "Oh, I didn't learn how to do it. I just started out at the bottom and I worked my way up." Right? I started out as a runner. I started making coffee on the film set or tea for people, and then I chose a job, and then I was an apprentice, and then I learned how to do what I now do on the job. And now that's really changed because everyone that I teach, all the young people who I teach media production and film production, they're doing a film production degree. Maybe some of you are doing this. They're doing 2, 3, 4-year degrees to learn how to do this. Now, I'm not really saying that one or another is a better way to go, because also now at least my students have to pay a lot of money for that education, right? And so oftentimes, unfortunately, those people who I do know who have got into the industry, again, they knew someone, right? They knew someone, and they knew someone who got them in somehow to get some work experience. So I'm afraid I don't know if I have the answer, except I think you should do it. And luckily with camera work, now it's not like it used to be. You can get a really incredible film camera for at least not quite as much money as they used to be. Oh no, now I'm saying the argument, you can just do it. I didn't really mean to do that. I'm sorry, I don't know if I have the answer for you. But I think it's possible. I believe it.
Окей, на этой умеренно, но оптимистичной ноте мы будем заканчивать. Огромное спасибо, Бриджет.